So I just wanted to start with a brief introduction about myself and my work so you get a better idea of where I'm coming from. Since I'm not an academic, I'm a practicing artist, and I'm really kind of coming from a personal perspective on my experience of the power and the meaning of visuals. So I studied painting and printmaking at Georgia State University. I graduated in 2000 and have been a practicing artist since then. I've shown in galleries around Atlanta. I was with Sandler Hudson for many years, and I'm now represented by Mason Mirror Fine Art, and this is from a recent exhibit that I had there. Okay, next. So my work has long been inspired by nature and science in a broad sense, with organic forms, plant-like forms, cycles of nature, and things like that coming into play. I think of them often as abstract landscapes, or even mental landscapes, because they do evoke nature, but maybe also something about memory and thoughts in the mind. So I think on both levels quite a bit. Next. So I make reference to microscopic imagery and tiny realms that are beyond vision, as well as natural forms. Next. And over the past year, I've been working with scientists from the Center for Chemical Evolution. I had a project grant to speak with the scientists and learn about their research and create work in response. So that project in particular has some interesting elements that we can talk about today as far as visual and learning. I view my work as having many layers of meaning. So there's the micro and the macro aspects, and presenting more than one perspective at a time. Next. And for me personally, the investigating science and nature, it's a way of just understanding the world and my place in the world, and sort of engaging with beauty and complexity that I perceive. Okay. And this is just a quick note. Another professional affiliation of mine is president of the Atlanta Printmakers Studio, which is a nonprofit in town. And so it's kind of a connection for me with the art community here, and a way of having printmaking in my art practice. Okay, next. Oh, you can skip that. That's also a print shot. So just in this first segment, a little introduction are some thoughts about thinking about the verbal versus the visual in art. And I thought I would maybe present a couple of artists as extremes to sort of form a scale to think about. So the verbal end is Lawrence Weiner, and the visual end will be Jackson Pollock. So next. So Lawrence Weiner, he was a prominent conceptual artist in the 60s, and his work has involved language and and just playing with text in a variety of ways. I think it particularly fits a discussion today because his description is of a visual form, and he actually sort of proposed that artists might not need to make the work, and that if you read that, your mind is going to conjure up the visual. I don't personally agree with that totally, but it's an interesting thought. Okay, one more. He did a series of statements that would either be published in books or printed on the wall and just read. So these are some samples, like many colored objects placed side by side to form a row of many colored objects. That's the one in the center, for example. So the other end of the spectrum is Jackson Pollock. He's a well-known abstract expressionist from the 40s and 50s, and he was known, for flinging paint. His work was about the act of painting itself, and really not verbal at all. Another one. Okay. So, it was celebrating the process of paint and the nature of paint being liquid. And I think there's one more. So at some point, he even stopped titling his works, and he started numbering them instead, so moving even farther away from something verbal. Okay. And as you can probably expect, those extremes leave most people in the middle. And I would even place my own practice somewhere in the middle, using verbal conceptions and visual components in my work. That's it for section. Hi, Steve.
Thanks. Yes, I'm Steve Everett. I'm a composer, and one of the things that this topic really triggered for me was a question I've sort of been having a long time, which is when I'm composing, when I'm listening to music, that I feel like there are different cognitive domains that I shift gears into for each of these activities. If I'm performing, there's another set of sort of skills, another thinking about the sound that goes on. As being a performer who works both in the classical field and the contemporary sort of avant-garde field, also being a jazz musician, I've been aware of certain musicians who tend to have facilities in oral understanding. Their auditory thinking is very advanced, but you put something, a visual, like a score, where they have to interpret those symbols and turn them into constructs, there's a blockage there. Other people, it's vice versa, it's just the opposite. They can read a score, but you ask them to do something without the score, they blank out. So that this understanding for how we think in the arts has always been sort of intriguing to me, and I try to understand that perception. So, you know, the auditory perception tends to be more linear, because auditory comes in, obviously, into a kind of a structure where we have a way of capturing information in a linear framework. So people who tend to think in terms of auditory are working in good linear pathways. If you go into then the visual has a different way where maybe we don't work, and like Terri was describing, where you, like the Jackson Pollock work, that doesn't really have any kind of linear structure to it. It's almost like you have to absorb the energy simultaneously, so it's outside of time. So visual thinking to me is about temporality some more. But there's another way that I'm aware of as a performer and so forth, which is the kinesthetic. The kinesthetic is where the body has its own rhythm of absorbing information from the outside world, and what is it about embodiment? So when I think about all of these put together, I'm reminded of, well, what is music about? What is the basis for music? This is a quote that from a scholar at Cambridge that I sort of like, where music, rather than simply being complex sonic pattern produced and received for aesthetic ends, which we tend to think of music as being primarily aesthetic, but to better be interpreted as a communication medium complementary to language that is deeply embedded in and that may be foundational respect of the species-specific human capacity to manage complex social relationships. When you look at trying to understand why do primates, and I include non-human primates in that group, why do primates tend to have patterns of sound that communicate certain important things in each species? Historically, that has existed throughout pretty much all, and you could go beyond primates if you want to go into birds and other types of species as well. But the interpretation of the meaning of sound is critical to our species, evolutionary. And that to me is an important part of understanding what's going on. So when we look at why does music and sound processing function so powerfully and evolutionary, there's a lot of theories about that. They tend to be focused on the social domain, that there are evolutionary adaptive benefits socially to being able to understand the meaning of sound. And as you'll see, these are just sort of the common assumptions about the understanding of music and evolution, where it promotes group cohesion, it strengthens emotional bonds between mother and infant. That's one of the most common understandings for when a child is born into a species and you need to find food and protection, being able to recognize the timbre of the, and the reason I say timbre is that's the critical factor. Why the auditory canal, why the cochlea, the basilar membrane, and the whole auditory system is so advanced, and why cognitive work has shown that music is processed almost in every part of the brain, much more than language, is because there's an evolutionary necessity that we as a species be able to interpret sound for protection, for food, to find that emotional content. If another one of the species is screaming, meaning that there's danger, that's obviously we need to be able to detect the subtlety of that and be able to respond to that. So you can see why the cognitive development, evolutionary, seems to be embedded much in sound processing and the meaning of sound, which to me is sort of the basic of music. So they go on as far as the understanding for how most of the theories about evolution are embedded in the evolutionary benefits of social integration. So we are doing music primarily for social reasons. So when you look at what kind of emotions are experienced in the understanding of music, this is a kind of a general mapping where when you look at music around the world, people say music is a universal language. it's a universal experience, but it's not necessarily communicating exactly the same things. This is a common way of sort of looking at what kind of emotions and what kind of musical sounds are fairly common in each culture. So if you're doing something that needs to express tenderness, most cultures will have similar kinds of qualities of tempo, slow tempo. They will use lower sounds. They will be more legato. They will have soft, darker timbres, very slow attacks. These tend to be fairly universal. Once you get into specifying scale, harmony, rhythms, there is no universality. Everybody has their own definition. But in these general characters, you can see that there are some similarities between the emotional expressions of musical content around the world. And this kind of keeps changing as I keep sort of coming up with new things. But this made me really focus on what is the most important parameter of sound that probably is carrying information. It's one that's probably talked about the least. And I'll get to that in my sort of second comments later, which is about timbre. And you'll see the relationship of timbre in each of these is critical. So looking at how we as species, when you understand how much of what goes into our musical understanding is encoded genetically, and how much of it is enculturated, how much do we absorb from whatever culture we're in. I spend a lot of time working in Asian cultures, musically in India, Indonesia, Korea, and Japan, and it really sort of changed the way I think about music. But when you go back and look before children have very much enculturation to try to understand what are the commonalities there, you start to see these information that before the age of 7, we really have all the encoding that's potential for your musical understanding the rest of your life is pretty much there. It's really, I don't have a slide on this, but it's been shown that you can study the brains of adults and in an fMRI, and you can actually predict by looking at certain constructs in the systems of the brain, by predicting whether the child or the person had active involvement with music before the age of 7. Because if there's active involvement with music on a high level before the age of 7, it actually develops neural pathways that you don't find in other populations. Another study that I heard talked about when they gave problem solving to certain individuals, not music-related problem, but just any problem, that they discovered that trained musicians could solve those problems with about 80% of the cognitive work of non-musicians, which meant that there was some kind of efficiencies in the system, in the brain, for processing cognitive thought that comes with complex musical processing that gave them a sort of faster cognitive benefit. So these are just some slides of sort of looking at, you can sort of see that recently there's been the attention executive functions are being shown, spatial reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and more efficiencies I just mentioned. Those are now starting to be showing that music participation has more benefits than just music itself. So I'll stop there and come back with my next comment later.
Hello. As Ashok mentioned, my name is Maithilee Kunda. I'm a graduate student in the Design and Intelligence Lab here at Georgia Tech. And intelligence is a concept that, for as many disciplines as we have experience with, everyone seems to have their own definition. I'll talk about one definition right now from the field of psychometrics, which has to do with measuring intelligence. In psychometrics, there's a notion that intelligence can be divided into 2 types. There's general intelligence, often abbreviated as G, or the G factor, which lies at the center of all of our cognitive abilities. And then this is in contrast to specific intelligences, which are domain or task-specific cognitive abilities that are very narrow and focused on one task or one ability. From the field of psychometrics, we've gotten lots of different types of tasks that tax different cognitive abilities. And on a chart like this, you can see there's different domains of abilities. There's numerical abilities, verbal abilities, and figural abilities, figural or visual. And there are lots of different tasks. As tasks move in from the periphery to the center, they grow more and more general. So the tasks toward the outside are very specific and narrow tasks, but as we move closer to the center, we come across tasks that are closer to measuring our general intelligence, or what we think of as general intelligence. It turns out that there's one kind of special task in the psychology literature that more than any other single task serves as a proxy for measuring general intelligence. So most of these tasks, you would only be able to determine a person's numerical ability or visual ability. But there's this one task called the Raven's progressive matrices, which gives a very good proxy for general IQ. It was actually originally developed in the 1920s and 30s as sort of a quick and dirty IQ measure. And it consists of problems that look like. So here's a very simple example of a Raven's progressive matrix problem. The task is to look at the matrix on top, see what element is missing, and choose the best fit answer from the choices. So any ideas on what the answer to this one? 5? Yes, 5. I heard 5. That is correct. The problems get a bit more complex. On this one, any guesses? You can be wrong. It's okay. 3. I heard a couple of votes for 3. That is correct. So it turns out that solving problems like this is a very good measure of a person's general intelligence. In cognitive science, we have studied how it is that people can solve problems like this. And it turns out that there have been several computational models of how people solve the Raven's test that have been developed over the last couple of decades. And interestingly, almost every single one of these models assumes a verbal solution strategy in which we're taking the inputs from the test, which are visual, converting them into verbal symbols and labels that are discrete and really lose the inherent visuospatial information from the problem, but still retain enough information about the relationships to successfully solve the problem. In our lab, we have been looking at a different type of strategy for solving this kind of test, which is saying, can we throw away that verbal conversion completely and reason directly on the visual inputs from the test? When you think about visual versus verbal reasoning, in verbal reasoning, there's lots of really well-studied techniques like using logical operations or rule-based systems. But visual reasoning also has some standard mechanisms for manipulating images that we can draw upon. I'm going to go over a couple of examples of these now. So affine transformations are a very basic form of image manipulation that include things like translation, rotation, and scaling. And while it's not clear that humans actually do these exact operations in our heads, there has been a lot of evidence from neuroscience and psychology showing that we can do operations that are computationally isomorphic in some sense. So when we're mentally rotating an image, for example, the time it takes for us to mentally rotate the image is proportional to the distance that we're having to rotate it. Another type of image operation is composition. So you can think about if you have two different images, you can combine them and look at the similarities and differences between the images in various ways. So we can combine two images by taking their union. We can look at their intersection, or what is shared between the two images. And we can also look at differences between the two images, so what is in one image but not in the other. And this type of image composition operation is useful not only for combining images, but also for looking at image similarity, because we can look at, for two images, what is shared versus what is different. Using these principles, we've come up with a model for solving problems from the Raven's test. And it works something like this. Essentially, given a Raven's problem, the model has in memory a set of these affine transformations. It'll take the top row, for example, it works on columns also, and it'll test each of these affine transformations to find some transformation that explains what it's seeing in the top row or the leftmost column. When it finds one that seems to work, it'll apply that transformation to the empty row or column to generate a guess for what it thinks the answer is, and then it'll choose, using the visual similarity measure I mentioned, it'll choose the most similar answer as its answer choice. So we've tested this model against the entirety of the standard progressive matrices, which is the normal Raven's test, the most widely used one. And I have some results here. So this graph shows the norms for human children in the US. Just to orient you a little bit, the x-axis here shows the age of kids in years. The y-axis shows their score on the test, which has a total of 60 problems. And the white line in the middle is the 50th percentile, so average performance. So an average 6-year-old will get about 14 problems correct. an average 18-year-old will get closer to 50, 52 problems. Our model right now, using purely visual operations on the test inputs, gets 38 correct on the test out of 60, which corresponds to a level of about an average 10 or 11-year-old, which we think is pretty interesting given that we're taking raw scans from the test and using only these types of visual operations to operate over these problem inputs. So to conclude, what we have been finding about cognition, so for a long time, conventional theories of cognition have looked something like this, where visual processing and perception is merely a means for getting input into the system. And once that input is in the system, it's converted into some kind of verbal symbols or labels. And then verbal processing is where the real intelligence lies. What we've been finding is that actually visual processing itself can play a role in the kinds of higher level cognition that we think of as forming the basis of even general intelligence.
I think for mine, can you do segment 3 instead of 2? I think it's a better flow from what you just shared. So in this segment, I was really just thinking about a few components that came to my mind as having an impact in a nonverbal way. And I think it relates to some of what you're saying, just the visual cognition. And that maybe some of these elements would give clues as we're trying to discover what visual thinking is. Go to the next. So color is very powerful. It expresses different moods and emotions. It's soft, it's pale, it's light, dark, vibrant, even fluorescent. I think maybe of any components, this is probably one that has had a lot of scientific research. I mean, I'm not an expert on psychology of color, but there definitely has been a lot of, red in movie theaters, and your dining room is supposed to make you hungry and things like that. So besides color, I think the materiality of artwork just has an impact when you view it. And this is maybe where I disagree with the Lawrence Weiner conceptual bit, because I think the material substance is really significant. You can do one more. So hard, soft, shiny, dull, metallic, dense, waxy, fragile. When you're in the presence of those substances, there is, it's hard. I'm even trying to find words to talk about, but it is like a feeling or a sensibility that you get when looking at it. This is a sculpture by Dale Chihuly, and if you've ever seen his glass sculptures in person, they're huge, and they're just powerful. They're fragile and wild, and the glass itself, it just has such an impact. The next. This is a sculpture by Richard Serra, and I think his work fits the materiality. That stainless steel, it's rusted. When you see it in person, it just has this feeling and presence, and scale is really the other component. You're just dwarfed by these huge sculptures, and looking at a photo of them is quite a different experience than when you're actually walking around, being towered over by them. So I was talking with these guys just earlier. This is just an interesting historic note on scale. This is a photo from the Atlanta Cyclorama, and I live near there, and I'm really kind of fascinated with this place. At the time, those were the immersive experience. It was like late 19th century, early 20th century, and there were a lot of them. They would travel around the country, and people would go see them, just like the circus or something. But that's a 40-foot, I think it's 42 feet tall, the painting in a circle, and yeah, like the IMAX of its time. So just I think that was a case of just really using scale and being immersed in a visual environment to teach people about things. And just to note that sometimes the impact of scale can be diluted by our digital world. I'm just showing a couple images. This is a painting called I Am a Dot, and if you will show the next one, that's called Twosome. And so when you look at them, they're taking up about the same amount of space on the screen, but in fact that first one is like 4 by 5 feet, and so there's a presence to it. It's very different. This one is 6 inches by 12 inches, so it's a much more, a little private, intimate painting. So it's just another case of the impact of scale when you experience art in person. What else do I have on here? I think next. So the last components, color, materiality, and scale. And this, the last one is like repetition and pattern. I think these are really important visual components that have an impact. If you have a single element by itself, it could seem sort of arbitrary or chaotic. But once you start repeating a thing over and over, even spacing them evenly, you create this sense of order that has a real effect on the way you view things. And it's something I use quite a bit in my art. The next one, this is a grid of prints that is called Visual Chemistry, and it's part of one of my current projects. That's it for the segment. Okay.
Once you get pulled up. As I was saying before, in trying to understand music perception, as a composer, I'm often aware of what image I have when I'm trying to create sounds, and sometimes that's linear. I can hear patterns of rhythms, of melodies, of things that tend to lay out in that sort of auditory perspective. Other times, there are things that come to me out of time, which makes me feel like that's more of a visual sensation, more like a visual artist would think in a space or a color or a scene, which makes me understand that this relationship between timbre, and I mentioned before, that's something that I've, over the last decade or so, I've really gotten to think that timbre is far more critical in our understanding of perception. Just as the reason evolutionary that we need to be able to dissect the emotional content of a timbre very quickly. We need to be able to analyze what's in that timbre, make some emotional understanding of it, and react to it from an emotional standpoint. So timbre is a critical part of that. I'm actually going to skip over this section on ecological approach to music perception. This is something that Eric Clark at Oxford University has developed based upon a theory of James Gibson, ecological psychology, which really tries to embed maybe all three approaches of a kind of a kinesthetic, a verbal, a visual, and an auditory perspective on this, which takes all information from the environment coming in that. So I'm going to kind of skip over that because the main thing I want to talk about is really looking at how the basilar membrane, when we start to study why the basilar membrane is designed the way it is and how it actually picks up not only a single frequency, the fundamental frequency that we hear, but all the different overtones, sometimes, and also usually sounds will have more than just a fundamental frequency and overtone. They will have what is called auditory roughness or auditory noise in the system. And it's been interesting to kind of go between cultures and understand that we develop culturally preferences for certain percentages of auditory roughness in the sound. And let me give you some examples of that. I'm going to kind of skip over this a little bit here. There's a little. For example, if we take a look at so you understand, when we're perceiving sound, we're usually identifying pitch, how loud it is, its timbre, how long it is, where in the space it's coming from, the direction of location, and also what kind of reverberant environment, which tells us something about the space more than the sound itself. All of those are unconsciously being processed when we listen to sound. As a musician, we're always trying to make sure we control each of those, make sure that the frequencies are all lined up together, make sure that the loudness is appropriate, we balance the orchestra, the violas are too loud, the trumpets comes, so forth. It's really about those qualities. We try to make sure that if we're in a dry hall from a musician standpoint, that everyone plays more legato, so we give the feeling that the sounds are connecting more. If you're in a very live resonant space, then you play more staccato, so to balance that. So all of those are factors that are in our music consciousness at all times. Auditory roughness is a term that started in 1885 by Helmholtz, and it really has to do with levels of instability and really high ratio partial content in the information. And what I discovered in looking at other cultures is that depending on your musical aesthetic preference, you're really liking or disliking something based upon its auditory roughness content. And it really hadn't hit me how strong that is. There are ways of measuring this quantitatively, and there are systems for doing this. The most recent one, 2005, Vasilakis, is a web-based system. You can actually take a little audio file, put it in, it will give you some measurements of how much noise, how much auditory roughness is in that. That's usually what I do on pieces. For example, if we listen to this excerpt. All right, we all know Jimi Hendrix. We all know the kind of distortion guitar he has. Listen to Kronos String Quartet trying to do an imitation of that on Stradivarius violins. When I play this for my students, they somewhat giggle, you know, because what for them that is almost humorous. It's the exact same music when you analyze the pitch, the harmonies, the rhythms. You know, the standard way of analyzing that music, what's different about it? Timbre. Why is the Jimi Hendrix distortion, the amount of roughness in that quality, so much more preferable to that music than a Stradivarius violin? We tend to adopt certain kind of aesthetic standards around that. Another example, one of my favorite forms is pansori out of Korea. It's a one singer and a drummer, and they tell a story. There are 5 major epics that they tell. This is Chun Young. And listen to the quality of this voice. Lots of auditory roughness. Sort of has Janis Joplin kind of quality. Now listen to this as another example. Completely different way of singing. Pure, we've reduced all the auditory noise. We have different kind of timbre structure. We have very stable pitches. Everything about it is the opposite. Each of those has a different reaction. If you are Korean and you've grown up listening to pansori, then you will have a particular kind of resonance with that. It will evoke a certain aesthetic response.